If you look at an old, say, 16th century map of the world, it's actually absolutely fascinating what you find missing.
Oh, definitely. The blank spaces are, they're very telling.
Right. You'll see the coastlines of Europe perfectly detailed, every little inlet and peninsula just meticulously rendered by these cartographers.
Yeah, down to the mile.
But then your eyes drift to the edges of the parchment toward entire other continents, and they are just, they're these vast, intimidating blank spaces, or perhaps even more revealingly, those spaces are filled in with illustrations of, like, mythical sea monsters.
Giant squids and sea serpents.
Exactly. And the famous warning, right? Here be dragons.
It is, it's a perfect encapsulation of human psychology, really.
Yeah.
Because a map maker can only draw what they know. Or, well, more accurately, they only draw what they care to know.
Right. What serves their immediate needs.
Exactly, their navigational or political purposes. The rest of the world, no matter how rich or heavily populated it actually is just a void to them. It's just waiting for their interpretation.
Yeah, and we generally accept that limitation when we talk about old physical geography. We sort of chuckle at it. But what is truly wild, what is actually profoundly consequential for you listening right now, is when we realize we do the exact same thing with the geography of human thought.
Oh, absolutely. The intellectual maps.
Right. We look at the standard Western history of philosophy, the one taught in, almost every university, and we draw this clean, unyielding, straight line.
The famous straight line.
Yeah, we start with the ancient Greeks, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and then we draw a line straight across the so-called Dark Ages to the European Renaissance.
And then right up to modern Western thinkers, like Descartes and Kant.
Leaving a massive centuries-long blank space right in the middle of our intellectual map.
Mm-hmm.
Or, at best, labeling that massive temporal space as a mere bridge.
Right, a sort of temporary historical storage facility.
Yes, where Greek ideas were supposedly kept on ice by Arabic translators until Europe finally woke up and was ready to claim them again.
But then, you actually step into that presumed blank space. You step into the actual world of Islamic philosophy, and suddenly you realize that space isn't blank at all.
Not even a little bit.
No, it is a sprawling, vibrant, intensely complex intellectual cosmos. It is an entire universe of thought that has been completely and sometimes deliberately mismapped by outside observers for centuries.
It is the absolute definition of a distorted intellectual cartography. And the tragedy is that by accepting that distorted map, we cut ourselves off from some of the most profound inquiries into the nature of reality and the human soul that have ever been articulated.
Which is exactly why we're doing this.
Exactly. So welcome to this deep dive into the source material. If you are joining us, we are here to bypass the surface level summaries. We are here to get into the weeds, to find those deep, paradigm-shifting moments of realization that change how you view the world, all without drowning in impenetrable academic jargon. We are going to chart the unknown territories.
Because to truly understand the modern world and our place in it, we have to understand how different cultures in completely different eras have ruthlessly pursued the truth.
Today, our source material is drawn from the incredibly detailed, illuminating writings of Seyyed Hossein Nasr. Specifically, we're focusing on his extensive work regarding Islamic philosophy and its study.
And our mission for this conversation is highly ambitious.
Very ambitious. We are going to execute a comprehensive overview of this text. We are going to remap the entire cosmos of Islamic philosophy. We'll look at how it has been studied and misunderstood by outsiders, how it actually views itself, the fierce internal battles it had to survive, and how it ultimately transformed the East. So, okay, let's unpack this.
To do this properly, to really set the stage,
Yeah.
I want you to imagine a profound visual shift. Picture stepping out of a, brightly lit, sterile, modern university lecture hall
Okay, I'm with you.
and walking into a vast, ancient, labyrinthine library. Picture walls lined with centuries-old manuscripts, the gold leaf of illuminated texts catching the low light, the heavy, rich scent of aged paper, leather bindings, iron gall ink.
It's a great image.
But before we can even pull a single one of these books off the shelves and open it, we have to do something crucial. We have to clear away our modern Western biases of what the word philosophy even means.
That is the perfect starting point because you literally cannot study the history of a subject until you define what the subject actually is. And we get lost in translation almost immediately here.
We really do.
Because in modern Western parlance, if I say to a friend, hey, what's your philosophy on that? It evokes a very broad, general worldview, right? Or in an academic sense, it usually means secularized reasoning logic that is completely cut off from anything divine, revealed, or spiritual.
Precisely. In the modern West, you can have a philosophy of art, philosophy of science, a philosophy of corporate management. It has become a very loose, highly secularized umbrella term.
Right.
But when we look at the classical Islamic languages, Arabic and Persian, the terms used are incredibly specific. You have al-Falsafah, which is a direct Arabization of the Greek word philosophia.
Okay.
But you also have al-Ḥikmat al-Ilāhiyyah, which translates roughly to divine theosophy or divine wisdom. And these terms do not refer to just any general school of thought or idle speculation. They refer to specific, rigorous, well-defined intellectual disciplines.
So we are talking about highly structured schools of thought, like the Peripatetic school, which is the Islamic continuation and expansion of the Aristotelian tradition, or the Illuminationist school, which we will get into later. The point is, these thinkers are not just sitting around under a tree pondering the clouds.
Not at all. And this is a fundamental, non-negotiable distinction that Nasr makes early in the text. For classical Islamic thinkers, philosophy is not what some of its later critics would dismissingly call mental acrobatics.
Right.
There is a brilliant, highly illustrative Persian wordplay used in the sources that captures this perfectly. True philosophy in this tradition is the discovery of truth based on absolute, unshakable certainty. The Persian word for this discovery, this finding of certainty, is yaftan.
Yaftan, okay.
Contrast that with mere mental weaving, the endless spinning of abstract theories without any spiritual grounding, which is baftan.
Yaftan versus Baftan, the discovery of absolute certainty versus the mere weaving of opinions. I mean, that is a gorgeous linguistic distinction.
It is profound because it sets the stakes. In this tradition, the human mind is not an isolated computer operating in a dark vacuum.
Yeah.
The intellect is continuously illuminated by two massive sources of light: the grace of the divine intellect itself and the specific guidance provided by revelation, by prophecy. True philosophy is the active seeking of certainty illuminated by those lights. It is not about wallowing in skeptical doubt or playing endless semantic games.
Okay, wait, I have to push back here, because if I am listening to this with my modern Western ears, red flags are going up everywhere.
Sure, absolutely.
If this pursuit of truth relies so heavily on revelation, and it relies on the concept of prophecy and divine light, isn't that just theology? I mean, how is this any different from a religion class or what they teach in a theological seminary? Why even call it philosophy?
That is exactly the question a modern post-Enlightenment mind naturally asks, and it is a completely fair challenge. But the source material makes a very clear, very rigorous distinction between the two.
Okay, how so?
Islamic philosophy is a distinct intellectual activity from theology. It does not rely solely on religious texts for its proofs. A philosopher in this tradition doesn't just quote a verse from the Quran and say, well, God said it, case closed, argument over.
Right.
Instead, they use rigorous, demonstrative logic, syllogisms, and rational discourse to build their case.
So they are using the tools of Aristotle, the tools of pure logic.
Exactly. But the key difference lies in the starting premise and the ultimate destination. The foundational belief of these philosophers is that truth with a capital T is one. Reality is unified.
Yeah.
Therefore, the truths arrived at through pure, rigorous, unyielding logical demonstration must ultimately harmonize with the truths of revelation, because both the intellect and the revelation come from the exact same divine source. Logic and prophecy cannot contradict each other if both are true.
Let me make sure I am grasping this. It is essentially like two different paths up the exact same massive mountain.
Yes, that's a good way to put it.
The theologian might take the path of dogma, relying heavily on the map of scripture and community tradition to get to the peak, while the philosopher takes the grueling path of logical demonstration and mathematical proof, carving their way up step by step. But they are both absolutely convinced they are going to meet at the exact same peak.
Yes, that is a beautiful way to visualize it. And as we will explore, these two climbers, the theologian and the philosopher, often shouted at each other across the mountain, clashing violently over how to climb it.
I can imagine.
But for anyone listening right now, keeping this specific definition in your mind is the master key to unlocking everything that follows. We are talking about a rigorous logical pursuit of a truth that is ultimately divine in nature. If you lose sight of that, The rest of the history just won't make sense.
Okay, so now that we have recalibrated our definition and we know what this tradition actually is, we have to ask, how has the Western world tried to understand it?
Right.
Because as we said with the map metaphor at the very beginning, the West has been staring at this territory for a long time, but often looking through incredibly distorted, smudge-covered lenses.
The study of Islamic philosophy in the West is not a new phenomenon. It actually has a 1,000-year continuous history.
1,000 years, wow.
Yeah. The text breaks this massive timeline down into 3 major phases. First, you have the medieval period, which was almost entirely about translating and studying Arabic texts, mostly into Latin, for the benefit of European monks and scholars. Then, you have the second wave during the Renaissance, which was a bit more expansive. And finally, the modern wave, which began in earnest in the 19th century and continues to shape our university departments today.
It is that third phase, the modern wave, starting in the 1800s, where things get really fascinating, because the sources detail 6 distinct modern Western schools of scholarship that tackled Islamic philosophy.
Yes, the 6 schools.
And when I was reading this section, I couldn't help but think of it like a bizarre murder mystery. It is like you have 6 different detectives arriving at the exact same crime scene, looking at the exact same evidence, the texts, but each detective has a completely different personal motive for being there, and they're all wearing different colored glasses.
That is a highly effective analogy.
Yeah.
Because what a detective brings to the crime scene totally dictates what evidence they bother to collect. Let's look at the first detective, the Catholic or scholastic school.
Right. So this detective walks into the room, and they are essentially looking for any fingerprints that match Thomas Aquinas.
Exactly. You have massive scholarly figures in this school, people like Etienne Gilson and Louis Massignon. They were coming from a deeply entrenched tradition of Thomism or Neo-Thomism.
Thomism being, of course, the philosophical school based on the writings of the medieval Catholic monk Thomas Aquinas.
Right. And because of that background, these scholars were primarily interested in the role Islamic philosophy played in shaping Latin scholasticism. They wanted to know how Arabic texts influenced their own intellectual ancestors.
So they were basically looking in the mirror, hoping to see the origins of their own reflection. If an Islamic text heavily influenced Thomas Aquinas, they studied it meticulously. If it didn't, they largely ignored it.
That's pretty much it. And within that broader Catholic umbrella, the text notes a very specific, localized offshoot, the Spanish Identity School.
Oh,
Scholars like Miguel Asen Palacios. They combined a Catholic theological lens with a fierce sense of Spanish national identity. They were heavily focused on the philosophical history of Andalusia, of Islamic Spain, and the Maghreb, trying to understand the intellectual heritage of their own physical geography.
so they were mapping their own backyard, essentially. Then you have the second detective, Jewish scholarship. This is a school with incredibly deep roots in rabbinical training and medieval Jewish scholasticism. You get giant figures dominating this field in the 19th and early 20th centuries, scholars like Harry Wolfson and Shlomo Pines.
And they made phenomenal contributions. But what is truly fascinating here, and what the source text explicitly points out, is how external modern political events can profoundly shape historical scholarship.
How so?
The text notes that the political turmoil following the partition of Palestine in the mid-20th century actually changed the fundamental attitude of many, though certainly not all scholars in this demographic group.
Wait, really? Did they stop translating, or what happened?
Not at all, but the lens shifted. The text observes that the geopolitical reality made many of them less sympathetic interpreters of traditional forms of Islamic thought. They became more critical, perhaps more detached.
Wow.
It is a stark, sobering reminder to anyone studying history that scholarship does not happen in a vacuum. The person translating a 12th century manuscript is deeply affected by the news they are reading in the morning paper.
That is incredible context. Which brings us to the third detective, the modern European or secular school. These are scholars who took the prevailing modern Western philosophical trends of their own day and forcefully applied them retroactively to the Islamic texts.
Right, projecting backward.
Yeah, so in the 19th century, you have a figure like Ernst Renan. Renan tried to paint the great Islamic philosopher Ibn Rushd, who is known in the West as Averroes, as the ultimate father of pure secular rationalism.
Renan was essentially projecting his own 19th century worldview backward. He was looking at Islamic philosophy through the secular, anti-clerical, rationalist philosophies that were popular in Parisian salons at the time.
He wanted a hero for his own cause.
Exactly. He wanted Ibn Rushd to be a hero of secular reason fighting against religious dogma, which is a massive, massive oversimplification of Ibn Rushd's actual deeply religious context.
To go back to our analogy, it's like the Marxist detective walks into the crime scene and tries to find the proletariat. It's wild. The text explicitly mentions how Marxist thinkers, both in the Soviet Union and in Western universities, produced volumes of work on Islamic philosophy framed entirely around Marxist class struggle.
It's true.
I mean, they are looking at a 12th century metaphysical treatise on the nature of angels and trying to extract a manifesto on the exploitation of the peasantry.
They are using a modern flashlight that only reveals certain colors of ink. If the text doesn't talk about material conditions, they view it as bourgeois mystification.
Right.
But within this secular European school, you also have giants who took a completely different path, most notably Henry Corbin. Corbin is a massive figure in this field. He didn't use Marxism, he used the insights of phenomenology.
Okay, let's pause and translate that. Phenomenology is a heavy word. For our listeners who haven't, brushed up on their 20th century German philosophy recently, what does that actually mean in this context?
Excellent point. Phenomenology, which was heavily influenced by thinkers like Martin Heidegger, whom Corbin actually translated into French, by the way, is essentially the study of conscious experience from the first-person point of view.
Okay.
It is about how things appear to us, rather than just analyzing them as cold, objective data. Corbin used this phenomenological approach to penetrate the inner, esoteric, lived meaning of Islamic philosophy. He didn't just want to know what a philosopher wrote. He wanted to understand the state of consciousness that produced the writing. He was trying to map the spiritual experience itself.
So Corbin is trying to get inside their heads, not just parse their arguments, which is actually the exact opposite of our fourth detective, the philological or Orientalist school.
Ah, yes, the philologists. Their background was primarily linguistic, grammatical, and historical. They were not, by training, theologians or deep philosophers.
So this detective is just standing at the crime scene checking the grammar of the ransom note.
Well, that is a bit reductive, but practically true. The text is very fair to them, noting that we owe them a massive debt of gratitude. They were fantastic at carefully editing, preserving, and cataloging important manuscripts that might otherwise have been completely lost.
They did the grunt work.
They did the grueling, unglamorous foundational work. But because they lacked deep philosophical or theological training, they often produced very few meaningful interpretations of the actual ideas contained within those carefully preserved texts.
Right. They could tell you the exact etymological origin of an Arabic word and what century it first appeared, but they couldn't tell you its metaphysical weight. They missed the forest because they were cataloging the bark on the trees.
Precisely. Which leads us to detective number 5, the comparative school. This movement emerged mostly after World War II as the West became increasingly interconnected and much more aware of other global intellectual traditions. You have brilliant scholars like Toshihiko Izutsu, who started looking at Islamic thought not in isolation, but alongside Far Eastern or Indian traditions like Taoism or Vedanta.
So they are looking for universal patterns across different cultures.
Yes, and this is a highly fruitful approach because it finally breaks Islamic philosophy out of simply being a subchapter of Western history. It stops treating it as just a reaction to the Greeks and looks at it as a vast, global intellectual phenomenon in its own right.
And finally, we arrive at the 6th detective, the Living Tradition School. And honestly, this one is my absolute favorite.
That's very compelling.
Because this detective isn't treating the evidence like a cold case. They aren't treating the texts as dead artifacts. They are actively trying to solve their own existential crisis with them.
That is very accurate to the spirit of the text. This school, which prominently includes figures like Seyyed Hossein Nasr himself and the later work of Henry Corbin, emerged in the second half of the 20th century. They began to study Islamic philosophy not as a museum exhibit or an archaeological dig, but as a living, breathing, desperately needed school of thought. They felt a profound inner need for authentic, grounded philosophical knowledge to answer the chaotic, fragmented intellectual crises of the modern Western world. They were looking for a cure.
So we have these 6 different lenses, 6 different detectives, and you pointed out something really interesting in your notes about how these Western approaches weren't static. They shifted radically as Western philosophy itself shifted.
Yes, the lens is always changing. The text points out that in the latter half of the 20th century, 2 major internal Western events dramatically changed how scholarship on this topic was conducted. First, the Second Vatican Council, or Vatican II in the 1960s.
Oh, interesting. How did that affect things?
Well, prior to Vatican II, Thomism was the absolute, unquestioned philosophical bedrock of Catholic intellectual life. After Vatican II, that strict, monolithic adherence to Thomism became somewhat diluted and diversified in many Catholic circles. Consequently, that specific, Aquinas-hunting Catholic scholastic approach to Islamic philosophy became much less common.
The first detective essentially retired, or at least took a back seat. And the second event?
The sharp, almost hostile split in modern Western philosophy between continental philosophy, which leaned heavily into existentialism, phenomenology, and critical theory in places like France and Germany, and analytic philosophy, which became obsessively focused on logic, language, and math, and became dominant in the Anglo-American world.
Right, the big split.
Exactly. A whole new generation of scholars brought these new, highly divided modern frameworks to their reading of Islamic texts. You suddenly had analytic philosophers trying to parse 11th century Arabic syllogisms with 20th century symbolic logic.
Okay, so if you are listening to this and feeling a bit lost in the weeds of all these different academic schools, let's zoom out for a second. What this really boils down to is this. Because these Western scholars, for centuries, had their own specific agendas, whether they were looking for Aquinas or looking for the proletariat or just parsing grammar, they ended up writing a history of Islamic philosophy that was, frankly, a massive distortion.
A total distortion.
Which brings us to the great historiography clash.
Yes, the narrative took over the reality. The 19th century European scholars, who were deeply rooted in a philosophy called positivistic historicism, essentially wrote the script that dominated Western universities for over a century.
And let's clarify positivistic historicism for a moment. That basically means the belief that human history is a straight line of inevitable progress, moving from primitive superstition toward glorious, secular, scientific rationality, right?
Exactly. It is the ultimate arrogant assumption of the 19th century. They believed they were at the pinnacle of human development. And based on that assumption, they wrote a script about Islamic philosophy, which, by the way, they inaccurately usually just called Arabic philosophy, totally ignoring the massive Persian and Indian contributions.
Oh, wow.
And their script said this: Islamic philosophy was nothing more than a bridge. It took glorious Greek philosophy, dressed it up in Arabic translations, held on to it during the dark, ignorant medieval period, and then, thankfully, handed it back to Europe during the Renaissance.
Like a delivery service.
Exactly. And most importantly, most destructively, they claim that this entire philosophical tradition effectively died with Ibn Rushd in the 12th century.
Which is just staggering when you really pause to think about it. It's like a historian saying American history ended with the Civil War and just ignoring everything that happened in the 20th century because it didn't fit their narrative. They wiped out 8 centuries of continuous, vibrant, complex intellectual life simply because it didn't fit their story of how the West gained its groove back.
It was a narrative of pure convenience. They ignored the later traditions because those later traditions were not translated into Latin and therefore did not directly influence the European Renaissance. The logic was breathtakingly circular. If it didn't impact the West, Western historians assumed it ceased to exist.
But the Islamic intellectual tradition itself views its own history completely differently, right? They don't see themselves as just a UPS delivery service for Greek ideas holding a package until Europe signs for it.
Not at all. The internal view is far more profound and, honestly, far more poetic. Traditional histories of Islamic philosophy often trace the ultimate origins of hikmah, or wisdom, not to Athens, but all the way back to the antediluvian prophet Idris, who is often identified in this tradition with Hermes Trismegistus.
Hermes. So we are talking about ancient pre-flood primordial wisdom. We are talking about the bedrock of human consciousness.
Yes. They viewed true philosophy not as a fragile human invention that evolves sequentially over time, getting better and better, but as an original form of revealed primordial truth. There's this beautiful anchoring concept in this tradition that truth has no history.
Truth has no history. That is a phrase that just stops you in your tracks.
It is a radical departure from the Western academic model. They argue that philosophical truth is a direct aspect of the divine truth. Therefore, while individual human perspectives might change, while vocabularies might shift from Greek to Arabic to Persian, the core truth itself is timeless and eternal.
So it's not a relay race.
No, it's not just passing a baton. It is a continuous accessing of the eternal.
So you have these two completely incompatible, explosive views of history. The Western view that Islamic philosophy is a dead utilitarian bridge, and the internal Islamic view that it is a living, primordial, timeless truth. And this clash finally came to a head in the mid-20th century.
That was the great turning point. In the 1960s, a genuine revolution in historiography took place. Scholars like Henry Corbin, Seyyed Hossein Nasr, and M.F. Sharif began publishing massive, comprehensive histories that aggressively, methodically fought back against the narrowness of Western historicism.
Finally.
For example, Corbin, Nasr, and Osman Yahya collaborated on the monumental Histoire de la philosophie islamique, published in French.
And this wasn't just a minor academic update like tweaking a footnote. This was them standing up in the middle of the global academic community and saying, hey, you missed an entire continent of human thought. They finally documented and acknowledged the massive post-Ibn Rushd tradition that flourished for centuries in the East.
They forced the academic establishment to recognize that the philosophy didn't die in the 12th century. It transformed, it evolved, it became deeply wedded to illumination and spiritual gnosis.
But, and there's always a but,
Yes.
to fully appreciate this newly charted territory, we run into a massive, immensely frustrating practical roadblock, which the source text highlights as an ongoing critical crisis in the field.
Yes, the translation problem. And this is where the rubber meets the road, because you can redraw the map all you want, but eventually someone has to actually read the texts to explore the territory.
Exactly.
I've had 1,000 years of Western study, right? But the text points out that, astonishingly, we still do not have a complete, standardized, bilingual collection of these foundational texts.
Right. If you study Greek or Latin philosophy, you have the Lobet Classical Library. It is the gold standard. You have a beautiful little green or red book with the original Greek or Latin on one page and a pristine English translation on the opposite page.
Exactly. Anyone can go buy them.
Yeah.
But we don't have that equivalent for the foundational world-changing texts of Ibn Sina or Mulla Sadra. It is a massive institutional failure.
And even worse, the text points out that when translations are done, they're often done by scholars with that heavily rationalist, secular Western bent we talked about earlier, and the vocabulary they choose actively betrays the core meaning of the text.
It is a subtle but devastating form of distortion. Let me give you an example. If an Arabic text uses a word that implies a sudden, blinding flash of divine illumination entering the heart, and the Western translator chooses to translate that word simply as logical deduction or cognitive realization, they haven't just mistranslated a word.
You've gutted it.
They have completely stripped the soul and the spiritual mechanics out of the philosophy.
The source quotes the famous Italian adage to describe this predatory translator as betrayer. If a translator approaches a text that was born in what they call the land of prophecy, a culture completely saturated in the divine with a purely secular, skeptical, clinical mindset, the resulting translation is worse than useless. It is an active distortion of reality.
But the text does offer a ray of hope here. This isn't a completely bleak picture.
Right, because a profound shift is happening right now, isn't it?
Yes. The source highlights that in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, we are witnessing a massive, highly encouraging increase in younger generations of scholars, both Muslim and non-Muslim, who are working together across boundaries.
That's amazing.
You have brilliant scholars from Iran, Turkey, and Pakistan coming to Western universities in Europe and America, and Western students traveling to study in the traditional centers of the Islamic world. They are actively collaborating on producing critical editions of these lost texts, trying to bridge this linguistic and philosophical gap, treating the philosophy finally as a living subject rather than an archaeological dig.
Okay, so we've heard what the West thinks of this philosophy, how they mapped it, how they mismapped it, and how they mistranslated it. But enough about the outsiders. Let's hear from the philosophers themselves. How did the master Islamic philosophers, the giants of this tradition, define their own quest for truth?
This is where we see the beautiful, organic evolution of the discipline itself unfold over centuries. The text provides a chronological deep dive into how the greatest minds define their mission, and it reveals a fascinating trajectory. Let's start with Al-Kindi.
Okay.
He lived in the 9th century and is often considered the first major Islamic philosopher.
Right, Al-Kindi. And he provides a definition that sounds somewhat familiar to a modern ear at first. He defines philosophy as the knowledge of the reality of things within man's possibility. But then he adds a crucial second part that completely changes the game. He says, the philosopher's end in his theoretical knowledge is to gain truth, and in his practical knowledge to behave in accordance with truth.
Notice the unbreakable linkage there. It is not just about knowing the truth intellectually, passing a test, and then going about your day. Al-Kindi demands that your physical actions, your ethics, align perfectly with that theoretical truth.
So you have to walk the walk.
Exactly. Knowledge and ethics are immediately inextricably intertwined. You cannot be a philosopher if you act like a scoundrel. Then we move forward a bit to Al-Farabi.
Al-Farabi is fascinating because he acts as the great systematizer. He makes this sharp, protective distinction. He talks about differentiating philosophy rooted in certainty, which he says is based on strict, unyielding demonstration and proof, from philosophy deriving from opinion, which he dismisses as just dialectics and sophistry. He is essentially putting up massive guardrails to keep philosophy from degrading into mere debate club.
He is establishing the rigorous Aristotelian logical foundation. He is saying we must build our house on solid rock. But then, as we move forward to the towering genius of Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, the definition of philosophy deepens dramatically inward. It becomes introspective.
What does he say?
Ibn Sina says that hikmah, or wisdom, is the perfecting of the human soul through the conceptualization of things and the judgment of theoretical and practical truths to the measure of human capability.
The perfecting of the human soul. I just want to pause and let that phrase hang in the air. That is so radically different from how we define philosophy today. I mean, if you go to an Ivy League university today and declare a major in philosophy, absolutely no one tells you that the goal of your degree is to perfect your soul.
No, definitely not.
They tell you it's to learn critical thinking or prepare for law school.
Exactly. For Ibn Sina, philosophy is not an academic exercise. It is a transformative, almost alchemical practice for the individual. But the tradition pushes it even further. We arrive at Suhrawardi in the 12th century, the visionary founder of the Illuminationist school.
Okay.
Suhrawardi insists that a true philosopher cannot just be a master of theoretical logic, no matter how brilliant. They must possess direct, visceral spiritual vision.
He has a specific title for this kind of person, right? He calls them the Muta'ali, the godlike sage.
Yes. For Suhrawardi, true wisdom is the act of the soul being actively imprinted by spiritual angelic truths. Theoretical, bookish knowledge and severe, ascetic spiritual purification are completely irrevocably wedded together. You cannot have one without the other.
Right.
A philosopher who only knows books but hasn't purified their heart is blind. A mystic who has visions but no logical training is easily misled. You need both wings to fly.
And this entire trajectory culminates spectacularly with Mulla Sadra in the Safavid period in Persia. Mulla Sadra achieves this massive, awe-inspiring synthesis of all these preceding schools, the Peripatetics, the Illuminationists, the theologians, the mystics. And his definition of philosophy is staggering in its ambition. He says philosophy is giving intelligible order to the world to gain resemblance to the Creator.
He describes the ultimate goal as man becoming an intelligible world resembling the objective world and similar to the order of universal existence. He is saying the human mind should become a mirror, perfectly reflecting the divine order of the cosmos.
That's incredible.
He even provides a breathtaking spiritual exegesis, a philosophical interpretation of a specific verse from the Quran, chapter 95, verses 4 through 6.
I absolutely loved this part of the source material. The Quranic verse says, "Surely we created man of the best stature, then we reduced him to the lowest of the low, save those who believe and do good works." And Mulla Sadra, rather than reading this just as standard theology, maps the entire project of philosophy onto it.
Right. He interprets the best stature as referring to the pre-material, spiritual world, and the angelic, luminous part of the human soul. The lowest of the low is the heavy, restrictive material world, and the base animal part of the soul that drags us down into bodily desires.
Okay, I'm following.
But then, here's the masterstroke. He maps philosophy onto the rescue mission. Those who believe refers to theoretical hikmah, attaining true knowledge of reality. And do good works refers to practical hikmah, aligning your actions with that knowledge.
So philosophy literally becomes the mechanism of spiritual salvation. It is the actual ladder by which humanity climbs out of being the lowest of the low and returns to its original angelic state. When you look at this multi-century evolution from Al-Kindi to Mulla Sadra, you see it start with defining reality and logic. And slowly, inevitably, century by century, it weds itself to spiritual ecstasy, illumination, and initiation.
That is the recurring, defining, structural theme of this entire civilization's intellectual life. In this tradition, knowledge cannot be divorced from action, and logical rigor cannot be divorced from spiritual purification. They are, as Suhrawardi suggested, two wings of the exact same bird.
Now, listening to this, you would think that this beautiful, noble pursuit of truth, combining the sharpest logic with the highest spiritual perfection, would be universally beloved and supported across the Islamic world. You would think kings would build monuments to it.
You would certainly think so, given how elevating the goals were.
But it wasn't. Enter the critics. Because we have to talk about the friction. There were massive, incredibly powerful forces within the Islamic world that strongly and sometimes violently opposed the philosophers.
The text outlines three main distinct sources of opposition, and each attacked philosophy for completely different reasons. First, you have the religious scholars, the practitioners of fiqh or Islamic jurisprudence.
We are talking about figures like the famous 14th century scholar Ibn Taymiyyah.
Exactly. For highly influential figures like Ibn Taymiyyah, their primary overriding mission was to preserve the purely transmitted sciences, the Quran, and the sayings of the Prophet on the exoteric, outward, legalistic level.
Okay.
They opposed philosophy simply because it stood outside the strict, defined boundaries of the Sharia, the religious law. They viewed this heavy reliance on Greek logic as an unnecessary, presumptuous, and potentially highly dangerous foreign innovation that threatened the simple purity of faith.
So they were policing the borders of the law. Then you had the second group of critics, the theologians, the practitioners of Kalam, specifically the powerful Asharite school. And let's explain why they attacked, because it wasn't just mindless dogma.
No, this was a much more intellectually intimate and sophisticated battle. The Asharite theologians were obsessed with protecting one supreme concept, the absolute, unconstrained, omnipotent will of God.
Right.
So when the philosophers came along, heavily influenced by Aristotle, and started arguing that God must act according to logical necessity, that even God is bound by the laws of logic, the Asharites panicked. They saw philosophy as arrogantly trying to put God in a rational box.
Which is a massive theological problem. If God is bound by logic, is God truly all-powerful? Theologians like Al-Ghazali and Fakhr al-Din al-Razi didn't just dismiss philosophy from the sidelines. They did the hard work. They learned it, they mastered its intricacies, and then they used its own logical tools to tear it down from the inside.
Yes, Al-Ghazali especially.
His famous book, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, was a devastating surgical strike against the purely peripatetic Aristotelian tendencies of the time. He felt the rationalists were overstepping the bounds of human reason.
And then you have the third group of critics, which I find to be the most fascinating of all, the Sufis. The mystics. They weren't attacking philosophy because it wasn't strictly legalistic like the jurists, and they weren't attacking it to protect a theological doctrine of omnipotence like the Asharites.
Why did they attack it?
They attacked it because they felt logic itself was a clunky, artificial barrier to divine love.
Yes. While some later Sufis would integrate philosophy, a very strong vocal tendency within early Sufism emphasized the radical discontinuity between puny human reason and the infinite divine intellect. They wanted to violently break the power of ratiocination, to shatter the ego of the intellect, in order to open the heart to direct, unmediated illumination.
And this philosophical tension leads to what I can only describe as an epic, multi-century poetic and philosophical duel. The text shares these incredible exchanges.
Oh, I love this part.
First, you have the legendary Sufi poet Rumi, taking a direct shot at the philosophers in his masterpiece, the Mathnawi. Rumi writes, "The leg of the syllogizers is a wooden one. A wooden leg is very infirm."
Let's unpack that imagery. Rumi is saying that a syllogism, a logical, step-by-step argument, is artificial. It is a prosthetic. It might help you hobble around in the material world, but it cannot support the true, crushing weight of spiritual reality. I mean, Rumi is kind of right, isn't he? If you subject the awe of the divine to rigid Aristotelian syllogisms, don't you lose the actual visceral, world-shattering experience of faith?
That is exactly the Sufi argument. Logic kills the mystery. But the philosophers did not take that lying down. Centuries later, a brilliant philosopher named Mir Damed writes a poetic response directly challenging Rumi's premise.
What does he say?
Mir Damed writes, "O thou who has said that reasoning is like a wooden leg, thou hast not distinguished between intellect and fantasy. Do not reproach demonstration, O thou who has not understood correctly."
Oh, wow. So Mir Damed is firing back, defending the sanctity of the intellect. He is saying that Rumi is confusing true, rigorous, divine demonstration with mere human fantasy and opinion. He is telling the greatest mystic in Islamic history that he just didn't understand the assignment.
It is a stunning rebuke, but the conversation doesn't end there. Later on, another towering thinker, Quwwal-Din Muhammad Shirazi, steps in as a mediator to defend Rumi from Mir Damad's critique.
Okay, playing peacemaker.
Shirazi writes that if Mir Damad truly understood the depths of Rumi's poetry, he would never raise his tongue in reproach. Shirazi explains that Rumi wasn't attacking the universal intellect, which is the divine guide on all paths. Rumi was only attacking the particular reason, the petty, argumentative, ego-driven logic, which is mingled with fantasy and lacks the light of divine vision.
So they are refining each other's definitions. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this multi-century poetic duel perfectly encapsulates the immense tension in this civilization. But here is the critical, counterintuitive insight from the source text. This opposition, as fierce as it was not destructive.
Not at all. It was immensely historically creative. It acted like a high-pressure alchemical catalyst. The fierce, devastating attacks by al-Ghazali and the mystics actually saved Islamic philosophy from itself.
How so? Because it seems on the surface like they are trying to obliterate each other.
Because if philosophy had just remained a stale, repetitive, insular form of Aristotelian commentary, just scholars writing notes on Aristotle's notes forever, it would have inevitably died out from irrelevance.
Right, it would have stagnated.
Exactly. But the intense criticisms from theology and mysticism forced philosophy to evolve. It forced the philosophers to address deep religious issues, to sharpen their logic to defend against al-Ghazali, and ultimately to incorporate the concepts of illumination and gnosis into their systems to answer the Sufi critique that logic was a wooden leg. The friction produced the immense heat necessary to forge something entirely new and far more resilient.
That is an incredible historical irony. The fiercest critics actually saved the discipline by forcing it to adapt. But this creative friction didn't have the same result everywhere. Which brings us to a massive geographic divergence that occurred after the 12th century, after the death of Ibn Rushd.
This is a crucial historical and cultural dynamic to understand. We are looking at a tale of two very different geographies. In the West, meaning the Arab lands of the Middle East, North Africa, and Islamic Spain, philosophy, as a distinct, rigorously defined, separate discipline, largely dies out after Ibn Rushd.
And let's remember, this is the exact geography that the Western European historians were looking at when they falsely claim the whole tradition died, right?
Exactly. They were looking at the right time but the wrong place. In the Arab world, the substance of philosophical thought didn't vanish into thin air, but it ceased to be a separate named discipline called Falsafah. Instead, it was absorbed, almost digested, into kalam theology and into the intellectual wings of Sufism. The theologians and mystics essentially took the tools of philosophy and internalized them for their own purposes, rendering the philosopher obsolete.
So if you only studied the Arab lands, you would reasonably conclude the philosophers packed up and went home. But if you turned your gaze east, the story is shockingly different.
In the East, specifically centering in Persia, but radiating outward to the Indian subcontinent and the Ottoman Empire, philosophy absolutely explodes. It doesn't die. It enters a golden age.
Wow.
It transforms into al-Ḥikmat al-Ilāhiyyah, that divine theosophy we defined earlier. It becomes a massive, living, breathing intellectual tradition. It acts as a structural bridge to the profound, almost overwhelming Sufi metaphysics of figures like Ibn Arabi.
And we have to ask why. Why did Persia provide such fertile ground for this explosion while it withered in the Arab West?
It is a combination of factors. Persia had a deeply rooted pre-Islamic heritage of philosophical and cosmological speculation. Additionally, the dominant Shiite theological environment in Persia was structurally much more open to esoteric, philosophical interpretation of religious texts than the Sunni orthodoxy that dominated the West.
And it becomes institutionalized in a completely different way, right? The text talks about how philosophy played a massive role in the machinery of these Eastern empires.
Yes. Philosophy provided the necessary rational framework that allowed Islamic civilization in the East to encounter and assimilate the learning of other massive cultures.
Right, the cross-cultural exchange.
It allowed them to translate and absorb Chinese and Sanskrit scientific and medical texts under the Mongol and Mughal empires without losing their own core theological perspective. And in the East, this philosophical tradition maintained a stubborn presence in the madrasas, the traditional universities. Its official status fluctuated wildly depending on the political and theological climate of whichever ruler was in power.
So sometimes it was funded by the state and sometimes it was banned.
Exactly. But the crucial point the text makes is that even when it was officially banned from the public curriculum by Orthodox authorities, it was always taught vigorously in private circles. Masters would teach students in their homes. The flame was never extinguished. It just went underground when necessary.
Okay, so the East is clearly where the action is. Let's zoom in on the most intense, defining rivalry that shaped this massive Eastern Renaissance, the ultimate centuries-long showdown between Hikmah philosophy and Kalam theology.
The shifting relationship between these two disciplines is literally the engine of later Islamic intellectual history. It drives everything. The text details a long historical arc of this relationship, which we can essentially break down into 5 distinct phases of interaction.
Let's trace that arc. How did it start?
It started with a period of parallel development, roughly up to the 9th century. During this time, the Mutazilite school of theology, which was highly rationalistic and favored using reason to interpret Scripture, was dominant. Because the theologians themselves valued reason, philosophy was allowed to develop side by side with relative mutual respect. They were staying in their own lanes.
But that harmony didn't last.
No, it leads into a second phase of intense, bitter opposition from the 9th to the 11th century. This is when the Asharite school of theology rises to political and cultural power, replacing the Mutazilites. As we discussed, the Asharites violently opposed the philosophers, viewing their reliance on logic as a direct threat to the omnipotence of God.
So if they started out in relative harmony, what was the catalyst that made the theologians suddenly turn so hostile?
It was a reaction to the perceived arrogance of the philosophers. As philosophy grew more confident, it started making definitive claims about the eternity of the world and the nature of God's knowledge, claims that directly contradicted literal readings of Scripture.
Oh, I see.
The theologians felt they had to strike back to save the faith. This initiates the third phase, the era stretching from Al-Ghazali to Al-Razi, roughly the 11th to 13th centuries. The attacks from theology continue relentlessly, but something fascinating happens. There is heavy mutual influence.
They start stealing each other's moves.
Exactly. Philosophy is forced to tackle heavy theological problems like free will, bodily resurrection, and prophecy, while theology becomes much more philosophical and complex in its argumentative structures. They are bleeding into one another.
Which sets the stage for a fourth phase, spanning the 13th to 16th centuries.
Yes, this is a period of more peaceful, highly sophisticated coexistence. You see the rise of systematic Shiite theology, brilliantly formulated by figures like Al-Tusi, who was himself a master philosopher and astronomer. In this era, you start seeing towering intellectual figures who are recognized as undisputed masters of both disciplines, effortlessly blending philosophical demonstration with theological defense.
And finally, we hit the fifth phase, from the 16th century onward into the modern era. And this is where the dynamic completely inverts in the East.
Yes. In this period, particularly in the Shiite world of Persia under the powerful Safavid dynasty, Hikmah, specifically Mullah Sash's synthesis, known as Transcendent Theosophy, begins to completely eclipse, dominate, and essentially devour Kalam. The philosophers win the day.
And Mullah Sadra, knowing he was winning, did not pull his punches against the theologians. I have to read the summary of his absolute dismantling of the Mutakalamun, the theologians, from his provocatively titled book, Breaking the Idols of the Age of Ignorance. He essentially says that all their complicated theological arguments originate not in a pure search for truth, but in a base desire for worldly glory. He writes that their true motivations are the desire for fame and social prestige throughout the land, the love to rule and to control the servants of God.
It is a devastating psychological indictment. Sadra is arguing that the theologians are trapped in endless dialectics, always arguing, always disputing, because their inner beings are not spiritually purified. They are just politicians in scholars' robes fighting for social status and dominance over the masses. Whereas true certainty, he argues, only comes from inner, intuitive knowledge and a complete rejection of worldly ambition.
He is basically saying, you guys are just arguing to hear yourselves speak and to get a better seat at the king's table. But the source text provides a really nuanced, brilliant counter-perspective from one of Mullah Sadra's own top students, a thinker named Lahiji.
The dynamic with Lahiji is fascinating. He studied intimately under Sadra, but later distanced himself publicly from some of his master's more radical esoteric views and became a highly renowned theologian himself.
Okay, a bit of a plot twist.
And Lahiji provides what I consider the definitive, most brilliant defense of why both disciplines, philosophy and theology, are absolutely necessary for a functioning civilization, but for entirely different reasons.
Right. Lahiji introduces this incredible martial analogy. He argues that Kalam theology is essentially a shield. Its primary purpose is defensive. It exists to protect the core doctrines of the faith from outside attacks and to maintain social unity and psychological comfort among the masses.
Yes, no doubt.
And to do that job effectively, it has to use premises and arguments that are widely accepted by the general public, whether those premises represent the absolute highest ultimate truths or not. It is pragmatic.
But hikmah, true philosophy, is the sword. Its subject is the raw, unvarnished, real nature of things, completely independent of public opinion, social utility, or comforting dogma.
Right.
Its goal is pure, unyielding demonstration to acquire absolute certainty and thereby perfect the individual soul. Al-Ḥikmat is arguing that you shouldn't condemn philosophy just because some philosophers make errors, and you shouldn't rely on mere theological imitation when the sword of truth is available to those strong enough to wield it.
A shield to defend the community's boundaries, and a sword to cut through the illusion to the absolute truth. What does it mean for a society to require both? It implies that the truth might actually be dangerous to the masses, doesn't it?
It absolutely implies an esoteric worldview. It implies that not everyone is psychologically equipped to handle the raw, unshielded truth of the sword. The masses need the shield of theology to live ethical lives, while the spiritual elite require the sword of philosophy to achieve perfection.
That's a very different way of looking at society.
And the final historical outcome of this showdown varied greatly by region. In Persia, as we noted, the sword of hikmah effectively replaced the shield of kalam as the dominant, prestigious intellectual force. But in Sunni India, through the brilliant work of figures like Shah Wali Allah in the 18th century, the two disciplines synthesized into a grand, beautiful harmony, fully integrating philosophy, theology, and Sufism into one comprehensive worldview that guided the subcontinent.
Okay, we have covered an immense, staggering amount of historical and intellectual ground today. We started by radically redefining philosophy itself, moving from the mere weaving of modern opinion to the active discovering of divine certainty.
We covered a lot of maps today.
We did. We corrected the distorted, arrogant map of Western historical timelines. We heard the master philosophers define their quest not as getting a degree, but as the literal perfection of the soul. We witnessed the multi-century poetic duels with the Sufis and the Ash'arites. We mapped the great geographic split between the Arab West and the Persian East. And finally, we watched how the sword of hikmah absorbed and transcended the shield of kalam.
The overarching, inescapable theme of this entire journey is resilience through transformation. Islamic philosophy survived, evolved, and reached unimaginable heights because it fiercely, stubbornly demanded that cold logical rigor be inextricably paired with inner, burning spiritual purity. It wasn't just about winning an intellectual argument or publishing a treatise. It was about the fundamental transformation of the human soul and aligning human consciousness with the divine intellect.
Which brings us directly back to you, the listener, because this isn't just dusty history. Think about our modern hyper-digital world right now. We are living in an era of infinite data, but severe wisdom poverty.
Oh, without a doubt.
If you log on to any social media platform today, what do you see? You see endless, exhausting, Callum-style dialectic arguments. You see millions of people using logic, rhetoric, and statistics not to find the truth, but fighting desperately for worldly glory and social prestige, exactly as Mullah Sadra warned us centuries ago.
We are constantly defending our political and social dogmas, using whatever rhetorical premises will win the argument of the day and get us the most likes.
Exactly. We are entirely surrounded by people wielding cheap shields, but there are very few true swords of truth to be found. We are drowning in Baftan in mental weaving and starving for Yaftan, true discovery.
It's a crisis of meaning, really.
So here's a final provocative thought for you to take away and mull over. What would a modern 21st century application of al-Hikmat al-Ilāhiyyah actually look like today?
That's the million-dollar question.
If traditional Islamic philosophy was the necessary antidote to the crisis of ancient Aristotelianism and rigid theological dogma, could its specific demand the absolute unyielding insistence that you cannot separate rigorous logical thinking from deep, inner spiritual purification be the exact cure we so desperately need for today's modern crisis of digital information overload, algorithmic manipulation, and endless, pointless argument?
That is a profound, incredibly vital question to sit with. If we want better answers, we might need to demand better, purer souls from those asking the questions.
Thank you for joining us on this massive, paradigm-shifting deep dive into the source material. Until next time.